Welcome back to Sonata She Wrote, the channel where we get just a little bit theoretical. Today, we are discussing Pietro Domenico Paradies' Sonata No. 6 in A major and the Type 2 Sonata of sonata theory. I know we rarely discuss history on this channel, but in this case, our focal composer is so little known, I thought some background would be helpful. Paradies was a Neapolitan composer who lived from 1707 to 1791, well before the end of the Baroque period and quite a ways into the Classical period. His name is sometimes re-italified to Paradisi, but an edition of the sonatas which were edited by the composer himself indicate his preferred spelling was the apparently anglicized Paradis. I don't want to stir up any trouble, but I'm going to go with Paradis for the time being. He hoped, like most of his peers, to be a successful opera composer, but this unfortunately failed to materialize. So the hopeful composer emigrated to England, that curious little island bereft of its own composers from the 17th century to the early 20th century. And he did find some success there, mainly as a teacher. He published one of the only works of his which still endures today, a set of 12 sonatas specifically for harpsichord or clavicembalo. His influences are Scarlatti and a lesser-known composer we'll soon see more of on the channel, Baldassare Galuppi. The piece we are examining today, the sixth in this set of 12, is most famous for its final movement, known as the Toccata in A. The name was not supplied by Paradies, but some other enterprising publisher. The first movement of this work appears to have been more or less forgotten by time, but it's so funky and fresh, I hope we can breathe some life back into it. Before we go much farther, let's hear the primary theme. A delightful theme in A major. We have an original idea here, and then Paradies expands it as we go along. We're spending perhaps a little more time than usual on predominance in bars 6 and 7. I've labeled it as 2/6, but you might call it 4. The phrase is 10 bars long, so I'd actually consider this 2-bar predominant section a phrase extension, but nothing too unusual. Bar 10, however, is that a proposed medial caesura? So soon? Now this is very unusual. Really, the exact same material of the primary theme, but in the parallel minor. I've labeled it TR because that's how it functions within the sonata, in that it brings us into the actual medial caesura. But it certainly doesn't have any of the usual rhetoric of a transition, and probably more accurately, it's simply a repeat of the primary theme in minor. In an article called Sunday Music, The Sonatas of Domenico Paradies, Donald Sander, professor of piano and faculty member at Stanford University, compares Paradies' style of sonata to the style many of us are more familiar with, a German style, which has its origins with C.P.E. Bach. Mainly, that Italian sonatas are typically more varied in structure, with between 2 to 5 movements, often formally arranged around and articulated by the melody, and that they could be somewhat harmonically bland, rarely straying from the tonic to dominant motion we typically see in the early Galant style. Obviously, there's a little to quibble with in what Sanders is saying, but I think we should keep in mind that he is speaking of a fairly small time period, roughly 1740 to 60, and that his article appears in The Musical Times, which was sort of a quasi-scholarly journal aimed at practical performers or highly skilled amateurs, rather than academics, which certainly means that it makes for much easier reading. Sanders points out 3 characteristics typical of Paradies' sonatas. First, a mixture of Baroque and classical styles. Second, rich and expressive harmonic vocabulary. And 3, highly original sonata forms. Simply by slipping into the parallel minor for a repeat of the primary theme, we already have number 3. Numbers 1 and 2 will become more apparent as we go along. Even more unusual, our initial secondary theme, energetic and scalar, seemed well placed to come to an essential closure. But this passage in bar 27 to 29 is kind of a rupture. It almost reminds me of a lament bass, the scalar descending bass line of Venetian opera, even though it's quite a bit longer than just 4 scale degrees. From this rupture, we're thrust into a kind of mutated iteration of the primary theme. The harmonies are not exactly shockingly chromatic, especially to modern ears, but certainly in comparison to other, potentially blander, music of the time, secondary dominants make for interesting listening, and I enjoy Paradisi's throwing a stone through Schenker's window. There is certainly no 5-line down to the structural closure in bar 44. What follows are 2 distinct closing zones before the second rotation. Is and isn't closing material, and what is or isn't secondary theme, is a little loose in terms of its borders. But I would say for our expositional layout, we have a primary theme, first in A major, then A minor, which acts as a transition into a medial caesura, which is followed by a secondary theme in E major, a second medial caesura. That's right, folks. We've got a trimodular block on our hands. A mutation of the original P theme in minor, and then a PAC in bar 40. This cadence, and the 2 that follow in the closing zones, have no major or minor quality to them. Paradies has left it ambiguous whether this is triumph or tragedy. A few final words from Professor Sanders before we move on to the concept of Type 2 sonata forms. In his article, Sanders writes of Paradies as being a progressive in 2 ways. First, he notes that the vogue of published keyboard works, and therefore in many ways the development of the keyboard sonata and sonata form itself, was largely due to a huge demand from aristocratic amateurs. These layabouts had little else to do but play at the forte piano or clavichord, and therefore many early examples of these works were somewhat virtuosic for the time. Not much from this period looks overly challenging to a modern pianist. But Paradies has eschewed this trend. These pieces are written more simply, and although it's easy to see they are intended for a 2 or 3 course harpsichord, as they do have dynamics, they would certainly have worked for a single keyboard instrument. Second, Sanders notes the quasi-romantic technique of shifting between major and minor modes, and Paradisi's own apparent view of the sonata form, less as a structure to follow pedantically and more as a template for musical drama, foreseeing the sonatas of Clementi, Haydn, and Mozart. Of course, we've seen the former already in the way Paradis casually moves between modes for dramatic effect, and the latter, I think, will be clear by the end of this video. One of Sanders' repeated points in this article is Paradisi's use of a shortened recapitulation. This is my main quibble with his writing. But it isn't Sanders' fault. Music theory as a whole was unaware of how to handle this type of sonata, which was very popular in the early classical period, what Hepokoski and Darcy call the Type 2 sonata. Crucial to understanding a Type 2 sonata is understanding Hepokoski and Darcy's view of the sonata as rotational. In a Type 3 or textbook sonata, there are 3 rotations of the material: the exposition, the development, which may or may not be fully rotational, and the recapitulation. In a Type 2 sonata, similar to a Type 1 sonata, there are only 2 rotations. But unlike a Type 1, which omits the development, see my discussion with conductor Anthony Barese for more information about that and Rossini's Barbaro Seville Overture, a Type 2 sonata includes a developmental section, which uses material from the primary theme, and then ends with a tonal resolution, the essential structural closure, in its usual place at the end of S. Hepokoski and Darcy stress the inappropriateness of using the term recapitulation to describe the second half of this rotation, as part of their theory involves a certain strictness to the secondary theme's role. S does not begin structural rotations, but follows a medial caesura and reaches a cadence. This may seem like a pedantic point, but viewing S more strictly can help add clarity to compositional choices when a composer is deliberately trying to obfuscate their use of form. If S appears to be opening a structural rotation, think again. That is never its role. Paradies begins this rotation with a straightforward repetition of the primary theme in the dominant major, sounding slightly unstable so high on the keyboard, as that position had previously been our mutation of the P theme's zone. This is followed by the dominant minor, functioning as TR material again, which, unfortunately for the narrative, is more solidly placed within the staff. What follows is an example of what Sanders meant by a mixture of Baroque and classical period compositional devices. This is an inversion of S2, which was based on the primary theme's material. This is where Paradies is also deviating from a typical Type 2 sonata a bit. He is mixing in material from the secondary theme and later, even from the closing zones, before returning to the tonic key and attempting a structural closure. Paradies is also cleverly subverting our expectation that he modulate into the global 6, F-sharp minor, by using F-sharp as a dominant to B minor, the global 2, and also the minor dominant key of E, which in a typical sonata has seriously tragic implications. Modulating to the dominant minor typically indicates little hope of reaching a major mode cadence. Entering the S section of this rotation, we seem to have solved none of the narrative issues raised in the exposition or development section. Unfortunately, the S is placed again in this teetering high register, and this section, again using a kind of lament bass idea or perhaps a Purcellian ground bass reference, Paradies was in England after all, seems to function as a device to bring us back to Earth and S2, at the end of which we again reach an ambiguous essential structural closure. Unlike the exposition, though, the cadential attempts which follow this moment are in a clear major, but they are also evaded PACs. In both cases, Paradies drops the bass out at the last moment. Is this sonata tragedy or triumph? I first heard this sonata on an album of 18th century Italian harpsichord music, the art from which was the opening of this video and our Paradies stand-in portrait. In reading the album notes, written by Edward Tatnall Canby, I was pleased to discover the author deriding the concept of great composers, and how that idea can be a hindrance to discovering and performing other music. Canby questions the utility of the idea of great men as it applies to both Italian and German music, but certainly in the realm of sonata form, this idea has been most damaging from a German perspective. There are, of course, complaints to be made about the elements of sonata theory, not least of which is the overly precise and academic writing style that unfortunately plagues all such books. But one that's become more and more interesting to me lately is the scope of the book. There are only a handful of composers who are not Haydn, Mozart, or Beethoven, whose music is listed in the pages-long Index of Works section. Of course, there is a reason for this. These composers certainly did more than almost any other to shape the modern idea of sonata form. But outside this little frame of three Germanic men is an entire continent worth of music. Sonata forms from all over: Italians, Scandinavians, Slavs, and Spaniards. Although I certainly do intend to continue to share the big sonata forms of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, I hope this channel will also be a place where we can take a deep dive into composers like Pietro Paradies and uncover some sonata techniques that are not in sonata theory. For example, Paradisi's modal mixture in every thematic zone. I hope you've enjoyed this video and taking a peek at the movement which is just as good as the more famous toccata of this sonata. And remember, in the composer's own writing in the edition of these sonatas, Paradies, never Paradisi.